My phone shook on the glass desk, tearing me away from the murder report. The Whitmore family group chat. A message from Kevin, sent 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, blared on the screen like an alarm. Big news, it read. My boss, David Roberts, CEO of TechCorp, will be joining us for dinner. This is very important for my career. Everyone needs to be exemplary. That includes you, Sarah. I stared at the words until the words swam before my eyes. I read them twice, 3 times. A bitter, familiar smile crossed my lips. Then my gaze rose to a framed photograph on the office wall. In it, I, in a formal azure jacket, shaking hands with David Roberts. Behind us, the TechCorp logo. Last quarter's board meeting. Kevin had never asked about the photo. To him, it was just some boring corporate background. There was a knock on the door. Dr. Whitmore, the TechCorp board materials have arrived. My assistant, Patricia, walked in, holding a heavy folder. Thursday's agenda includes a fourth quarter review and a final decision on the Ether Systems merger. Thank you, I nodded, accepting the folder. Its weight was solid, real. I'll review them this evening. Patricia paused, watching my face. You're smiling. Good news? I couldn't help but let out a small, almost manic chuckle. My brother just invited my fellow board member to our family Thanksgiving dinner. He has no idea we know each other. Oh, Patricia's eyes widened. This should be interesting. Interesting? I leaned back in my chair, the cold steel frame reminding me of my stability. This will be the spectacle of the century, Patricia. And I won't even be the director. I'll just take my usual seat in the audience. A familiar, tight knot tightened inside me. My name is Sarah Whitmore. I'm 41 years old, and I've spent my entire life sitting in this very seat in the shadow of my own family's neglect. Kevin, my younger brother by 3 years, was always on stage, the golden boy, the prize, the protagonist of our family saga. My straight A grades paled next to his certificates of merit for participation, which my father looked upon with tears of pride. My gold medal, my scholarship to MIT, my degrees, all of it was nice. And his barely earned diploma from the local university, a late bloomer's triumph, crowned with a brand new car. I've built a career he could only dream of. A professorship at Stanford, a best-selling book on AI ethics, board seats. I spoke at the TechCorp board, and David Roberts listened attentively, taking notes. My revenue last year exceeded $4 million. And at home, I was still Sarah the teacher, modest, and probably in need of advice from my businessman brother. Oh, and what about that advice? Last Christmas, when Kevin, puffed up with importance, announced that David Roberts himself knows his name, my mother looked at me with pity. You should learn from Kevin, dear. He really understands how the world works. I remained silent. Because what could I say? That 2 days earlier, David had listened to me for 3 hours before approving an $8 billion deal? To tell would have meant shattering their comfortable, beloved fairy tale. And I was tired of being the one who ruined everything. Kevin's messages after the announcement pounded like a drumbeat before an execution. Instructions for Dad on cleaning, Mom on cooking, and me on the dress code. Nothing weird, and don't talk about your teaching stuff. It's boring. The last message hung in the air. Don't embarrass me. I took screenshots. I sent them to Jennifer, my friend on the board of directors. Her response was instant. Oh my God, you're mean. I love it. Then I called Monica, David's assistant. Upon hearing the story, she laughed, loudly and shamelessly. David only agreed to come so Kevin would stop pestering him. He'll be there for an hour, tops. Does he know Kevin is your brother? Not yet, I said, looking out the window at the bay. I think we'll keep it a surprise. Dr. Whitmore, you're merciless. This is the best thing that's happened all year. A week before the party, Kevin sent the outfit. A floral dress from Target, size L. I'm a size S. It lay on my couch, tasteless and indifferent, like his entire approach to me. Please wear it. You always dress like a librarian. I glanced at the tailored, perfectly fitted theory suit hanging in the closet, at the perfect white blouse. at the pumps that cost more than his monthly car payment. "I'll wear my clothes," I texted. His reply came instantly. "Thank you, Sarah. This is important. Can you just keep things simple for once?" I left the message unread. On Wednesday, the day before the holiday, my phone rang. Kevin appeared on the screen. I sighed, anticipating a storm. He began without a greeting, his voice tense as a bowstring. "I need to brief you about tomorrow." I pressed the phone to my ear, looking out the window at the bay. "Brief me on what, Kevin?" "A meeting with David. He's on a different level, Sarah, the CEO. He's not interested in abstractions. You need to be respectful. Don't ask stupid questions. And for heaven's sake, don't talk about things you don't understand." Something sank in my chest, cold and sharp. "Like what?" "About technology, about business, anything corporate." His voice sounded like he was explaining to a child why they shouldn't touch fire. "Just stick to your teaching, or the weather, or your garden, okay?" "Kevin," I said slowly, feeling every letter of my education burn on my tongue. "I have a PhD in computer science. I think I can hold my own in a tech conversation." He snorted. The sound was familiar and humiliating. "Having a degree isn't the same as actual field experience, Sarah. David built a $15 billion company from a garage. You grade student papers. Those are two different things." I closed my eyes, counted to 10. Inhale, exhale. "Something else?" "Yes, don't mention your age. You're 41 and you're alone. It's embarrassing." The silence on the line turned pitch black. "Embarrassing who, Kevin?" "Family. David's a family man. He has a wife and kids, a normal, successful life. I don't want him to think our family is full of weird old maids." He paused as if searching for the words that would hurt less and couldn't find them. "You're a tenured professor at Stanford. That's great, but you're not a CEO or anything. Just let me talk tomorrow. You can smile and nod, okay?" He hung up without waiting for an answer. I sat in my office at Stanford surrounded by silent witnesses to my success. Stacks of research papers, glossy magazine covers of my interviews, a photo of David and me shaking hands in front of the TechCorp logo. The air rang with the unspoken. And then I picked up the phone and dialed a number known only to a few people in the world. David Roberts' personal number. He answered on the second ring. "Sarah? Everything all right?" There was a hint of concern in his voice. Calls from board members in the lead up to the holidays rarely boded well. "Everything's great. Quick question. Are you having Thanksgiving dinner with Kevin Whitmore tomorrow?" A hint of irritation crept into his tone. "Unfortunately, yes. He's very networking. Figured it was worth popping in for an hour to talk about his sales numbers, to cheer up the team. Standard CEO stuff. So what?" I took a deep breath. Kevin Whitmore is my little brother. Silence. A long, utter silence, in which I could almost hear the gears in his brilliant, strategic brain grinding together. "Sorry, Kevin Whitmore from sales." "Your brother? The one who sends me weekly reports on his KPIs and offers fresh ideas for business development?" Exactly him. How the hell could I not know that? Because he doesn't know I'm on your board of directors. My family, they're not aware of the scope of my work. They think I'm just a professor who lectures and grades papers. There was a sound on the other end of the line. It was quiet at first, then building. David was laughing. Genuinely, loudly, almost choking. "You're kidding. This is brilliant." "No, Kevin has been instructing the family on how to behave for 3 weeks now. I, in particular, was told not to talk about technology because I have no real-world experience." "You," he continued laughing, "literally wrote the risk analysis for our acquisition of Ether Systems. Your work on the ethics of machine learning is what we reference in every shareholder report. You're one of the most influential minds in the industry." "Kevin doesn't know that," I repeated softly. "To him, I'm just his sister who grades his work." His laughter died down, replaced by a quiet, almost reverent admiration. This is incredible. What do you want me to do? Nothing. Just show up. Be yourself. Let things flow. Sarah, his voice took on a warm, almost friendly tone. I have to tell you, this could be the highlight of my year. Thanksgiving. I pulled up to my parents' house promptly at 2. My black cashmere sweater was soft as a cloud. My pants fit perfectly. I felt like myself, calm, unshakable. Kevin met me at the door. His quick, appraising gaze swept from head to toe, and his face twisted. I bought you a dress. I'm wearing this, Kevin. Sarah, stop being stubborn. His whisper was sharp, like a dagger. Mom appeared from behind him, wringing her hands. Sarah, honey, maybe you should change. Kevin's boss, he's not in the same league. I know, Mom. Dad appeared in the hallway, his brows furrowed. Sarah, your brother is trying to build a future. You could at least show a little support. I wear my own clothes, I said, my voice surprisingly even. If Kevin's boss has trouble finding quality cashmere, that probably speaks to some troubling trends in his business model. Kevin grabbed my elbow and pulled me aside. Why do you always have to complicate things? What's your problem? I wear clothes. It's not complicating. It's a basic human action. You know exactly what I mean. This is important to me. Why can't you ever just be on my side? I looked straight into his eyes, those familiar ones that never saw me. I'm here, Kevin. Isn't that support? He looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time, with bewilderment and hurt. Sometimes I just don't understand you. Likewise, I quietly replied. By 4, when David was supposed to arrive, Kevin was already on edge. He was pacing, adjusting the vase on the dresser, constantly checking his watch. At 3:45, he lined us up in the living room like a soldier. The plan is, when Mr. Roberts arrives, Dad and I will meet him at the door. Mom, you offer drinks. Sarah, his gaze slipped from me, you can help in the kitchen. Add water, check the turkey. I won't hide in the kitchen, Kevin. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to be helpful while remaining out of sight, so this doesn't turn into another one of your academic monologues. I sank slowly, with dignity, onto the sofa. I'll stay. Right here. His face twisted in panic. Sarah, please. At that moment, the doorbell rang. A ring so charged with significance that the air in the room trembled. Kevin flinched as if struck by an electric shock, frantically straightened his tie, and took a deep, trembling breath. Everyone, model behavior. This is the most important moment of my career. He swung the door open. David Roberts stood in the doorway, wearing dark slacks and a white shirt with the top button undone, holding a bottle of wine. He looked exactly the same as he had at our meetings, only without his jacket. Calm, confident, radiating that quiet strength that comes with true power. Kevin. Happy Thanksgiving, he smiled, holding out the bottle. Mr. Roberts, welcome. Please come in. Kevin's voice rang with tension. David stepped over the threshold. His gaze, accustomed to taking in the essence of a room in a second, slid over my parents' familiar faces, the furnishings, and settled on me. He froze. Absolutely, completely, as if time had flipped a switch. Sarah? I looked up and met his gaze. I smiled the easy, calm smile he'd seen hundreds of times in our meetings. Hello, David. Happy Thanksgiving. Kevin's head jerked toward me, then toward David, then back to me. His confident smile began to slip like a mask. You know my sister? David didn't answer. He looked at me, and his eyes showed not just recognition, but a whole cascade of reality-shifting processes. Sarah? What are you doing here? Thanksgiving, I said softly. This is my family. But he was already turning to Kevin, and I saw how, in his sharp, analytical mind, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a click that seemed to echo throughout the quiet living room. Kevin Whitmore, your brother, David said, not as a question, but as a statement of an incredible, obvious fact. Unfortunately, yes, I nodded. Kevin's face went from confusion to a glimmer of hope. they're just casual acquaintances, to complete bone-chilling horror as David slowly turned toward him. "Your sister," David Roberts said in his low, clear general's voice that cut through the silence like glass, "is on the board of TechCorp. She's been a board member for the last 4 years. We meet monthly to make strategic decisions." The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a living, dense substance that filled the room, pressing on my eardrums, displacing the air. The silence was shattered by the sound that burst from Kevin, something between a hoarse chuckle and a death rattle. "It's impossible." "It's quite possible," David said, still looking at me with pure, unadulterated amazement. "Sarah is one of the most valuable members of our board. Her expertise in AI has shaped our strategic direction for years to come." My mother, pale as a sheet, seemed to have woken up from a stupor. "But Sarah, she's a professor at Stanford." "She's a tenured professor, yes," David nodded, his voice laced with the respectful patience with which he explained complex concepts to investors. "But she also sits on the boards of 5 Fortune 500 companies. Mine is among them." He slowly turned to me, and I saw in his eyes not only surprise, but a whole range of other emotions: surmise, admiration, even guilt. How could I not know that? How could we have worked together all these years and I didn't know Kevin was your brother? "Different last names," I shrugged, feeling the slight tremor finally subside. "In professional settings, I've always used my maiden name. Well, the one I had left over from my marriage." "You were married?" Kevin's voice broke into a falsetto. He looked at me as if he'd never seen me before. 6 years. We divorced 3 years ago. You didn't notice because you never asked." Dad rose abruptly from his chair, and the old wooden frame creaked pitifully. Wait a minute. You're on these corporate boards. Since when?" 4 years at TechCorp, about 7 years on the other boards." "And you haven't told us a word," Mom exclaimed, her voice sounding less offended than confused. "I told you, Mom, many times. You'd say, 'How sweet,' and steer the conversation to how Kevin closed the block." David, standing at the center of this family vortex, watched the exchange with genuine, almost clinical interest. He tilted his head back as if studying a fascinating business case. "Excuse me, I'll interrupt. Are you saying Sarah told you about her position on corporate boards and you... what?" "They didn't take it seriously," I said quietly, looking at the carpet pattern. "They thought it was some kind of minor consulting gig, not worth discussing." Kevin finally found the strength to formulate his thought. His face was ashen. "You are on the board, the real board of directors, the one who makes decisions for the company." "Yes, Kevin, on the board. I'm on the compensation committee and the technology and oversight committee. Among other things," I nodded toward David, "I approve your CEO's compensation package. Among other decisions." David finally broke down and allowed a wide, defiant smile to spread across his face. He tried to hold it back, but it was too much. "Sarah, let me clarify. Did your family honestly think you were just teaching? They thought I was a professor who graded student papers and occasionally published papers that no one but fellow eccentrics read. Your book on AI ethics is a must-read at MIT and Stanford." David's voice took on a lecturing, almost solemn tone. "It's cited in thousands of studies. Your work has fundamentally changed the industry's approach to machine learning." Kevin, unable to stand any longer, sank heavily into the nearest chair. He didn't sit up. He collapsed, as if every muscle in his body had suddenly atrophied. Dad stared at David, searching for any hint of humor in his words. "Is that true?" "Absolutely. Sarah is one of the world's leading experts. Companies pay her up to $200,000 for a single consulting project. Each board seat brings her between $300,000 and $500,000 a year." Mom covered her mouth with her hand. The sound of a soft sob was muffled by her fingers. "She makes more than I do," David continued, his tone now clearly tinged with relish at the absurdity of the situation. "And I, mind you, am the CEO of a company with a market capitalization of $15 billion. That's not quite a fair comparison, I gently corrected. Your compensation package last year was $12 million. My total income is around $4 million and a bit. Fair enough, David agreed, but you get that money without the headache of managing 20,000 employees every day. Kevin stared at me. His gaze was blank, devoid of any understanding. $4 million, he said, not as a question, but as a mantra, trying to imbue the words with some kind of meaning. Roughly, depends on consulting projects and speaking fees. Speaking fees, he repeated, parrot-like. I give keynote addresses at major industry conferences. The standard fee is between $50,000 and $75,000. Silence fell over the room again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Heavy, thick, saturated with the collapse of an entire universe of ideas. David, to his immense credit, had behaved impeccably. He turned to Kevin, his voice sounding almost innocent. You know, Kevin, I remember now. You once mentioned that your sister works in retail? A deep, painful flush crept across Kevin's cheeks. I probably said she was in education. No, you said retail. I remembered that because I thought, it's weird, a brother in high tech and a sister somewhere in a shopping mall. I don't remember that. I remember it distinctly. It was about 3 months ago, in my office. You just started insistently inviting me to this dinner. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. My voice was quiet, but each word fell into the silence like sharpened steel. Kevin, why? Why did you tell your boss I worked in retail? I may have simplified it for understanding. You were ashamed, I breathed out. I said it without malice, with a strange, chilling clarity. For me, for what you thought I was doing. So you lied. That's unfair. Really? You've been asking me for years to keep quiet about my work, not to bore people with my highbrow research, to let you talk because I have no experience in the real world. Dad coughed, trying to regain control of a situation that had long since slipped beyond all reasonable control. Sarah, we didn't know because you didn't shout it from the rooftops? I've been on boards for 7 years. I told you about the meetings, the decisions we made. You nodded, said, interesting, and asked if I knew how Kevin could increase his sales. David resumed his observer's stance. His gaze slid from face to face, analyzing, assessing the power dynamics that were being redistributed seismically before his eyes. If I may, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, what did you think Sarah's job entailed? Mom whispered, looking off into space. We thought she was a professor, teaching classes, writing articles. She does, but at the same time, she's one of the most influential voices in the global tech industry. Her research has influenced legislative initiatives. The ethical framework she developed for AI is being adopted by corporations around the world. We didn't know, Dad muttered, and for the first time, his voice took on a lost rather than accusatory tone. Because you didn't want to know, I said. And finally, that same bitterness that had been building for decades broke through in my voice. Kevin's work was exciting, important, worthy of a toast. Mine was boring academic nonsense, awkward to discuss at dinner. Kevin jumped to his feet. His chair slid back with a bang. I need some air. He almost ran out the sliding door into the backyard. David glanced at me, raising an eyebrow questioningly. Should I talk to him? He asked quietly. You decide, David. As the CEO of an employee in shock, or as my colleague witnessing a family drama? Which role do you think is more appropriate? The corners of his lips twitched. I'll be right back. Through the glass door, I watched as David, hands in his pockets, walked slowly and confidently toward Kevin. He was standing hunched over by the fence. I saw Kevin gesturing, his shoulders tense. David stood motionless, listening, nodding occasionally. He was like a rock against which a turbulent wave was crashing. An unbearable, sticky silence hung in the living room. Finally, without looking at me, Mom whispered, Sarah, why didn't you really tell us? Really? I closed my eyes tiredly. I did. Last Christmas, I mentioned that I'd been invited to join the board of another big company. You said, "How sweet, dear," and immediately asked if I was finally dating someone decent. But bored? That word can mean anything. My father's voice was filled with a desperate desire to find a loophole, to soften the blow. It means exactly what it says, a corporate board of directors. But you chose to think of it as something petty, unworthy of attention, because the idea of my true success didn't fit into the comfortable, beloved fairy tale. Dad frowned, his brows drawing together in a familiar grimace of irritation. That's an unfair generalization, Sarah. Really? I looked him straight in the eye. When I got a tenure position at Stanford, you asked if that meant I'd finally be able to afford a proper house. I already owned a house, Dad, a paid-for, 4-bedroom house in Palo Alto. That cost $3.2 million. Mom blinked. She blinked slowly, as if her eyelids were heavy with new, overwhelming knowledge. You own a house? 6 years. You never came over. You never asked to see it. You never asked about my life beyond the standard, "So, are you dating anyone?" We thought you were struggling. Dad's voice was muffled, almost defensive. Alone, at the academy. We thought you needed support, but you were just too proud to ask. Something broke inside me, completely and quietly. I earn more than both of you combined. I have an investment portfolio worth $8 million. I drive a Tesla Model S. I afford myself 4 international vacations a year. The only thing I've struggled with my whole life, Dad, is understanding why my own family prefers not to know who I really am. At that moment, the sliding door opened. David and Kevin returned to the room. Kevin entered with his head down, his eyes red, his eyelids puffy. He looked as if he'd been turned inside out. David's face was an impassive mask of professional reserve, behind which, knowing him, I sensed a storm of thoughts. "I suggest," David began cautiously, breaking the oppressive silence, "that we all sit down at the table as planned, and perhaps use this dinner as an opportunity for a more honest conversation." We moved into the dining room. The movements were mechanical. Mom served the turkey and stuffing in an almost ceremonial, deathly silence. David, a diplomat to the tips of his fingers, tried to mend fences. "Everything looks wonderful, Mrs. Whitmore. Thank you so much for your hospitality." "Of course," Mom whispered silently, without even looking at him. Kevin hadn't looked up at me since he'd walked in the door. He stared at his plate, as if the pattern of his mashed potatoes held the key to his shattered reality. David turned to me, deliberately setting a professional tone. "Sarah, I was just about to ask, did you finish that paper on algorithmic biases, the one you presented at the MIT conference?" "Finished last week. Accepted in the Journal of Machine Learning Research. Comes out next month." "I can't wait. This could be critical for our new recruiting platform. We're currently discussing the risks. I'll send you an advance copy." Dad cleared his throat, his gaze darting between David and me, trying to grasp something comprehensible. "Mr. Roberts, David, what is Sarah doing on your board?" "She provides us with expertise we can't buy anywhere else," David answered, without a shadow of a doubt. "The world of technology is moving at the speed of light, especially AI. Sarah helps us see not just technical feasibility, but also the ethical implications, the sustainability of decisions, and strategic risks. She translates the future into a language we, as managers, can understand and act upon." "Can you give me an example?" Mom asked quietly, her voice not filled with idle curiosity, but with a desperate attempt to piece together a shattered puzzle. David glanced at me, asking permission. I nodded briefly. "Last quarter, we were considering acquiring a facial recognition startup for approximately $3.2 billion. Sarah spent 2 weeks deeply analyzing their algorithms and training data sets. She uncovered a fundamental bias that would not only have made the product discriminatory, but also exposed the company to enormous legal and reputational risks. Her report saved us from a disastrous investment." She did it?" Dad muttered, his eyes filled with disbelief mingled with nascent awe. "She. The board voted unanimously against the deal, relying solely on her findings. And 6 months later, that same company was hit with a class action lawsuit for the very problem Sarah predicted, a $400 million lawsuit. Kevin seemed to be trying to sink through the floor. His shoulders were hunched with tension. Sarah isn't just on the board, David continued, his voice taking on an almost paternal warmth. She's shaping our future. When we talk about AI integration, about self-learning systems, we wait for her verdict first, because she sees what even our best engineers don't. She sees the consequences. I didn't know Sarah was doing anything like this, Mom whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Most people don't know. Board work is confidential. I can't divulge details. But all these years, when I said I went to meetings, served on committees, consulted for companies, it was all the truth. You just never asked what it really meant. Kevin finally spoke. His voice was hoarse, cracked. I told everyone that you just graded students' papers. I know. I told David that you work in retail. And I know that too. He clenched his fists in his lap. Why didn't you ever correct me? Why didn't you stop me? I looked straight at him, and in that moment, I felt genuinely sorry for him. Would you believe me, Kevin, if I looked you in the eye and said, I make $500,000 a year sitting on the board of your company? Would you believe me? Or would you laugh and tell me not to make things up? He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. There was no answer. There was only shame, thick and silent. David carefully cut into a piece of turkey. For what it's worth, Kevin, your sister is one of the most impressive people I've ever worked with. She's brilliant. She has the gift of seeing things clearly. And what's most rare is that she's completely devoid of vanity about her own genius. Unlike some who loudly proclaim their supposed successes, I added quietly, not taking my eyes off my brother. He flinched as if struck by an electric shock. Sarah, Mom began, her voice trembling, we owe you an apology. For what exactly, I asked, and my question sounded not like a challenge, but like a sincere desire to finally hear it out loud. For not seeing you, for real. For not listening. For automatically putting my achievements below Kevin's, I added. For asking me not to bore people with my work. For celebrating every mediocre deal he made while ignoring my real, tangible victories. Dad shifted helplessly in his chair. We didn't want... But that's exactly what you wanted! My voice wavered for the first time all evening. Kevin was your son, your golden boy. His career, even if it was your imagination, was important. And I was your daughter. Too smart, too independent, too different from what you would have liked. It was easier to believe in my modest, unremarkable life. The silence that followed these words was broken only by the soft clatter of David's fork on the porcelain. He took a sip of water, set down his glass, and said delicately, I think this is a very personal conversation. Perhaps I should... Stay, David, I interrupted, not taking my eyes off the family. You're, oddly enough, the only person at this table who's ever seen me as an expert, and not just Kevin's unfortunate sister. He nodded and sank deeper into his chair, adopting the role of silent witness. After dinner, as Mom and Dad were gathering the dishes in mute confusion, Kevin approached me. Can we talk? Alone? We stepped out onto the front porch. The November night clutched us with its cold fingers. The air was sharp, and our breath steamed. I'm sorry, he blurted out immediately without looking at me. I'm sorry for everything. What part of these years of lies, Kevin? I asked, wrapping myself in my arms. Everything, his voice broke. For telling David about retail, for telling you to keep quiet, for telling your family for years that you were just a teacher and making you feel like a nobody. He looked at his shaking hands. For believing that lie. Why? I asked, and it was probably the most important question of my entire life. Why did you do that? He fell silent, and in the silence, I could hear a dog barking somewhere in the distance. Because you scared me, he finally managed to say. That was unexpected. Scared me? How? You were always smarter, always achieving more. A's while I was scraping by with C's. MIT while I barely got into a crappy college. A PhD, books, awards. He swallowed. It was easier for me to convince myself that all this was just theory, irrelevant to the real world, that I was the one standing on the ground and doing real work. It was easier to breathe that way. My work is real, Kevin. It changes the real world. I see it now, he rubbed his face with his palm. I probably always saw it somewhere in the back of my mind. I just didn't want to admit it. Not to myself, and especially not to you. Why? I repeated. He looked up at me, and there was such an unguarded, childish pain in his eyes that my heart sank. Because then I would have to admit that you achieved everything on your own, without Dad's help, without connections, without any of the privileges I had. You were simply better, in everything. And I always lost in the competition that I alone started. I leaned against the cold railing, feeling exhaustion wash over me. I never wanted to compete with you, Kevin. I know, he smiled bitterly, but I did, desperately, and I lost, on every level. It wasn't a competition, I said quietly, looking into the dark abyss of the street. It was just life, mine and yours, and they were different. It was always a game for Dad, Kevin whispered, staring into the darkness as if the words were burning his throat. The golden son versus the disappointing daughter. Except the daughter turned out to be 1,000 times more successful than that golden son could ever have dreamed of. Sarah, he turned to me, and his eyes held the naked, undisguised arithmetic of despair. I make $65,000 a year. You make $4 million. Your house is worth more than I could ever earn in my entire life. You sit at the same table with people Dad watches on TV. You've surpassed us all so much that we can't even measure the distance. And you allowed us to believe lies because I couldn't bear the truth. The truth that the sister I've considered second-rate my whole life is actually the greatest success in our entire family history. I remained silent. Let him sit with it. Let the bitterness soak through him like a November chill. David, out there in the yard, Kevin continued, his voice trembling. He asked why I did all this. I started babbling something about misunderstandings, about the difference in our careers, and he simply looked at me with that general's gaze and said, I see a man so insecure about his own worth that he's forced to push his own sister into the shadows to make himself seem superior. He didn't pity me. David doesn't waste time on false politeness. He said I should be proud of you, that if I had a sister on the board of my company, I'd be shouting it from the rooftops. And I hid you, belittled you, did less to make myself seem greater. That's how it was. That's exactly how it was. He took a deep breath, and the steam from his breath dissipated into the darkness. Can you forgive me? I looked at my brother, at this eternal boy who had heard for 38 years that he was the son in the family system, whose identity was built on being important, and whose fragile structure had just been shattered by the realization that the unlucky sister was the one who truly mattered in the world beyond the walls of this house. I don't know, I said honestly. And there was more compassion in that honesty than in any lie. It's not just one lie, Kevin. It's years of systematic belittlement. For years you made me feel like my work was something shameful, boring, unworthy of attention, that my successes were an inconvenient curiosity. You turned me into the family joke, that eccentric professor who made your modest victories seem epic. I know, and I apologize, but he hesitated, and that pause held the whole point. But would I apologize if David hadn't come tonight? If this dinner had gone as I planned? If I'd considered you just a teacher for years? He paused for a long moment. His jaw worked. I don't know. Probably no. At least you're being honest about that. What should I do now? His question sounded childishly helpless. That's your decision, Kevin, but you need to understand one thing once and for all. I don't need you to be proud of me. I don't need Dad's approval or Mom's admiration. I've built a life that suits me perfectly, without your applause, without your understanding. It happened despite your indifference. It seems you don't need us at all, he managed to squeeze out, and his voice carried not resentment, but a bitter insight. I haven't needed you, not for a long time. I needed you when I was 18, floating alone in the ocean of MIT, when I was defending my dissertation at 25, and my only holiday was a pizza alone. When I was going through a divorce at 30, and the warmest voice on the phone was my lawyer's. You weren't there. You were too busy being Daddy's golden boy and his devoted support group. Sarah? I'm not angry, Kevin. I'm just free. Free from having to pretend, from having to shrink to give you more room, from the eternal game of, yeah, sure, tell me more about your sales. It's so interesting. He wiped his face with his sleeve. I ruined everything. Yes, you did. Can we fix this somehow? There was futile hope in his voice. I don't know. Can you live with the fact that your sister is more successful than you? Can Dad? Can Mom? Or will you all still be more comfortable with me being that lonely, perpetually struggling loser who makes you all seem so successful? There was no answer. A cold wind caught his silence and carried it away into the night. We returned to the house. In the living room, David was about to leave, adjusting his coat. Thank you for dinner, Mrs. Whitmore, he said to Mom, his voice filled with genuine, if tired, warmth. And for a most enlightening evening. Before he could open the door, Dad rose from his chair. His face was serious, almost stern. I have a question. David turned around, adopting the familiar stance of a man prepared for a difficult negotiation. I'm listening. Everything you said about Sarah, is it true? Or were you exaggerating to teach us a lesson, to put us in our place? I opened my mouth to respond, sharply, decisively, but David gently but authoritatively raised his hand, stopping me. His gaze was firm. Mr. Whitmore, he said without a hint of condescension, there's no room for exaggeration in my work, especially when it comes to professional reputation. Sarah serves on the boards of 5 Fortune 500 companies. That's a level unattainable for 99.9% of professionals. Her research isn't just interesting, it's changing industry standards. Her consulting fees are comparable to those of world-class executives. She's been published in the Wall Street Journal, MIT Technology Review, and Forbes. Last year, she gave a presentation at the World Economic Forum in Davos. That's not an exaggeration. Those are facts. Mom gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Davos, David repeated for clarity. They invite heads of state, Nobel laureates, and the heads of the world's largest corporations. I told you I was invited to give a talk on AI ethics, I said quietly, looking at Mom. Remember? You asked me if I liked Switzerland. You mentioned a trip, Mom whispered, and the painful strain of memory was visible in her eyes. I asked if the weather was nice there, and immediately turned the conversation to Kevin receiving the Best Salesman of the Quarter award, I finished for her. Dad turned to Kevin. You did receive an award. Kevin's face flushed with shame. Yes, for the third quarter. It's a standard award for those who meet their targets. Dozens of people receive it. That's commendable, David stated softly, but relentlessly. But this isn't Davos. The comparison hung in the room, heavy and undeniable, like a weight. Dad sank heavily onto the sofa, as if his legs had given out. How could we not see all this? Because you didn't want to see it, I said, finally letting all the pent-up bitterness spill out into my voice. You needed a convenient story, an eccentric, unmarried intellectual daughter, and a promising, realized son. To admit that your daughter is not just successful, but incomparably more successful, would be to destroy your entire worldview, your priorities, your understanding of who is worth valuing. What story? We've always supported you both. My father's voice took on the familiar, exhausted defensiveness. No, you supported Kevin with money, connections, boundless attention, applause for the slightest achievement. I supported myself with the scholarships I won, the loans I took out, 3 jobs at once, and yet I still rose so high that you couldn't even see me in all that lofty heights. Not thanks to you, in spite of you." David quietly headed for the exit, giving us space. "I really have to go. Good luck to you all." "David," I met his gaze. "Thank you for coming. See you on Tuesday for the scheduled meeting." "I can't wait. And Sarah," he smiled a thin but warm smile, "you're still my first point of contact for any strategic AI initiative." "Always ready," I nodded. He left. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving the 4 of us among the ruins. The ruins of illusions built over 41 years. "Tell us," Dad said suddenly. His voice was hoarse. "Everything, from the very beginning, about your work, about your achievements. We want to know." I looked at him, at Mom, at Kevin. Their faces were filled with a mixture of remorse, shock, and a kind of greedy, belated thirst for knowledge. "Why now?" I asked, good-naturedly, but also without compromising. "Why not 7 years ago when I first joined the board? Not 4 years ago when my book came out? Not 2 years ago when I returned from Davos?" "Because we didn't understand the magnitude," Dad said, but his words were unconvincing. "No, because you didn't want to understand. That's a huge difference." Mom wept quietly, making no attempt to wipe away her tears. We failed you, dear. So badly." "Yes," I agreed, and there was no cruelty in this agreement, just an acknowledgement. You failed. "Can we somehow fix this?" Her question, echoing Kevin's, hung in the air, fragile and naive. "I don't know," I said, my words quiet but inexorable, like a death sentence. "Can you even live with this? With your daughter, your sister finding herself on top of the world, where your son, your brother, can't even reach? Can you truly be happy for me without immediately wondering how Kevin will feel now? Will you finally be able to see me, the real me, not the convenient version you've created for your own peace of mind?" Kevin spoke first, squeezing the words out through a lump in his throat. I'll try. I promise I'll try." "Trying isn't enough, Kevin. Here, you either accept reality as a whole, with all its inconvenient truths, or you continue to live in a fantasy. But I will no longer cower and hide for your peace of mind. Never again." Dad looked broken. Not angry, not hurt, just broken. Everything he believed in collapsed before his eyes. What do you want from us?" he asked, and his voice lacked its usual command, only confusion. "Nothing," I replied, and those words contained all my new, heavy freedom. "That's the point. I don't need your blessing. I don't need your recognition. I've built an entire universe without it. I'm happy. I'm fulfilled. You can be a part of it, but only if you enter through the front door of truth, not the back door of your illusions." "And what truth?" Mom asked quietly, as if afraid of the answer. I stood up, not for drama, but because these words needed to be spoken from my full height. "The truth is, I'm Dr. Sarah Whitmore, a Stanford professor, a member of 5 corporate boards, one of the world's leading experts on the ethics of artificial intelligence. I'm the author of industry-changing books. I'm a consultant paid outrageous sums to save companies from their own blindness. I earn $4 million a year. I own a house worth $3.2 million, and it's fully paid for. I've traveled the world speaking to the people who truly rule this world. I've achieved all of this myself, and I've done it despite the quiet but constant message that I'm secondary, that my success is less important, less real, less worthy of attention than my brother's." Silence filled the room. It was thick and dense. Kevin broke it, his voice hesitant but insistent. I told my colleagues about you. Today, after David left dinner." I looked at him, surprised. I went into the general sales chat and wrote that my sister is a board member at TechCorp, that she's an AI genius, that she's one of the most influential people in the industry. "Why?" I asked, confused. "Because David asked me how I usually introduce you to people. And I realized I don't at all. And he said, if my sister were Sarah Whitmore, her name would be the first thing I'd say when introducing myself. And he was damn right. And what did they say, your colleagues? They were stunned. They asked why I kept it a secret, why I didn't brag, and I didn't have an answer. Not a single sane one. There is an answer, Kevin. You were ashamed. Not of me, of my success. Because it, like a spotlight, illuminated your own mediocrity. He winced, but didn't argue. He simply lowered his head. Mom suddenly stood up, walked over to the old carved cabinet, and pulled out a thick, tattered photo album bound in velvet. She placed it on the table and silently began flipping through it, page after page. There was Kevin's graduation, dozens of pictures, smiles, proud faces. My graduation, 3 modest photos in the corner. There was Kevin with another Best Salesman certificate, an entire series. My diplomas, my awards, they simply didn't exist. There was Kevin's wedding, lavish, happy. My modest nuptials, not even worthy of a separate spread. This is who we were, Mom whispered, running her finger over the dusty plastic wrap. Her voice trembled. This is what we thought was important to capture. Yes, I agreed, and an old, familiar emptiness ached in my chest. Exactly. And can we be different? There was a plea in her question. That's up to you, I said, closing the album. Only you. I left at 9. The drive to Palo Alto flew by in silence, broken only by the whisper of tires on the asphalt. I felt empty and incredibly light, as if I'd torn off a casing I'd been wearing for years. My phone vibrated on the dashboard. Kevin, I'm sorry. Again, I know it doesn't change anything, but I had to say it. Mom, please come for Christmas. We'll try. We want to try being different. Dad, I'm proud of you. I should have said it every day. I didn't answer. To anyone. I arrived at my dark, quiet house, poured a glass of rich Cabernet, and went out onto the terrace. The lights of the bay shimmered below, cold and distant. I was home. A text message came from Patricia, my assistant. So, did you survive? How did the big family showdown go? Exactly as expected, a complete disaster. My brother's brains nearly blew out his ears. Did the CEO enjoy the show? Immensely. Now he knows one of his salespeople has been spinning lies about his sister's career for years. I think that will add some spice to the next performance reviews. You're terrible, Dr. Whitmore. I'm being honest, Patricia, and that's not the same thing, you know. On Monday morning, the phone rang. David, I need to ask you something. Not as CEO, as a friend. Talk. Are you okay? Friday was intense. I'm fine, David. More than fine. I'm available. Free from what? His voice rang with genuine curiosity. The need to pretend, the desire to seem less than I am, the constant worry about what my family will think. He paused. Kevin sent me a long letter of apology for misleading me about you. He asked if it would affect his career. And what did you say? That personal life and professional work are different things, but that honesty is a quality that transcends context. It's either there or it's not. Diplomatically, I chuckled. I guess that's my job. He paused again. You know, watching the way you held yourself that evening, calm, with cool dignity, with absolute clarity, it reminded me once again why you're on my board. You have that inner strength that most people lack, even at my level. Thank you, David. That means a lot. See you on Tuesday. The board meeting on Tuesday proceeded in its usual business-like manner. Numbers, strategies, forecasts. And at the end, as they were about to disperse, David raised his hand. Before we finish, I want to return to one point, off the agenda. Last week, I had a unique experience. I attended Dr. Whitmore's family Thanksgiving dinner. Several eyebrows around the table rose. And it turns out her family had no idea what she does, that she's on this board, or any board, that she's one of the world's leading minds in her field. A stunned silence fell over the room. Jennifer, who was already in the know, only smiled sadly. "How is that even possible?" one of the board members, a Wall Street financier, finally asked. I shrugged. "Very simple. I don't flaunt my achievements to those who don't see the value in them." David nodded, and something akin to pride shone in his eyes. "It's precisely this lack of vanity, this absolute self-confidence without the need for external recognition, that makes you invaluable, Sarah." The board of directors burst into applause. Sincere, respectful. After the meeting, several colleagues approached me. "We couldn't even imagine that a family—" "Most people can't imagine," I interrupted softly. "I'm used to separating worlds, the professional one, where I'm valued, and the personal one, where I haven't been seen for years." "But it's painful," said one of the women, the vice president of a large foundation. "It was," I admitted, "and now it's just a fact. Their ignorance is their loss, not mine." And in that moment, I realized I was saying this without a hint of falsehood, for the first time. Christmas arrived. The phone buzzed again. "Please come. We want to celebrate you this year. For real." I almost said no. I practically decided to spend the day in the quiet of my home with a book and excellent wine. But something stopped me. Not hope, more like a cold, detached curiosity. I arrived on Christmas Eve, without gifts, without expectations, empty-handed and intentionally empty-hearted, ready for anything. And the house was different. Not rearranged, but reconfigured, as if someone had changed the lens. The first thing I noticed was that on the mantelpiece, where Kevin's sports trophies had once adorned the room, now sat my book on AI ethics, modestly framed. Next to it, a printed copy of a Forbes 40 Under 40 article with my face on it. And on the living room wall, prominently displayed, was a photograph from the stage at the World Economic Forum. Me at the microphone, and in the audience, a sea of faces, all of whom I was trying to prove something to. Mom noticed my gaze gliding over these artifacts. "We studied," she said quietly, rubbing her hands as if from the cold. "Printed out articles, bought your book, watched your TED Talk." "I have 3, I automatically corrected, still not believing it was happening. We watched all 3, twice. Kevin emerged from his office holding a printout covered in yellow highlighter. "I tried to read your paper on algorithmic biases, the one in the Journal of Machine Learning. I didn't understand everything, honestly, but what I did get, it's brilliant, Sarah." "Thank you," I breathed out, and that was all I could manage. Dad appeared, wiping his hands on a towel. "Sarah, glad you came." His eyes didn't hold his usual condescension, only a strained but genuine caution. "Me too," I replied, and to my surprise, I realized it wasn't entirely a lie. Dinner passed in a strange, polite silence until Mom suddenly put down her fork. The loud thud of a plate made everyone jump. "We'd like, if you don't mind, to hear, really hear, about your work." She looked at me, and in her gaze I saw not a demand, but a request, a mistake trying to correct itself. I glanced around the table. Mom, Dad, Kevin. 3 people who had looked away for years. Now they were looking at me and waiting. "What exactly do you want to know?" I asked, and the door of the very cage in which I had voluntarily confined myself creaked open. And I began to speak, usually concisely, without emotion, like a presentation to the board, about meetings where the fate of billions was decided, about scientific breakthroughs born on sleepless nights, about students whose eyes lit up with understanding, about congressmen who listened, taking notes. I spoke for 2 hours, and they listened, without interrupting, without looking at Kevin, without turning towards its sales. When I mentioned a $200,000 fee for a single project, Dad didn't flinch. When I told him how I'd saved the company from a $400 million lawsuit, Mom didn't ask if I was cold in my blouse. When I described how I'd testified before the Senate committee, Kevin didn't start telling me how he talked to important people, too. It was awkward, unfamiliar, like walking on new, unaccustomedly steady legs. At the end of the evening, Dad cleared his throat. "I'm proud of you." He spoke with effort, as if the words had been rusting in his mouth for decades. I should have said it every day for the last 20 years, but I'm saying it now. "Thank you," I said again, and this time there was a fragile, barely perceptible crack in my voice. "Can we start over?" Mom asked, not erasing the past, but trying to build something new on top. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Can you?" "We want to try." I looked at Kevin. "And you?" "I told everyone at work about you," he said quickly, as if afraid he'd change his mind, "that my sister is on the board, that she's an expert, that she's a game changer. I've been bragging about you for the last few weeks." "It's a change," I stated. "I know. And Sarah, I'm sorry. For everything. For the years I used you as a foil, for being afraid of your light, for lying about who you are." "Apology noted," I said neutrally. He wavered. "But not accepted?" "Not yet, but maybe someday." He nodded, and there was a bitter understanding in that nod. Some walls, torn down by a single explosion of truth, are rebuilt brick by brick in agonizing silence. 6 months after that Thanksgiving, Kevin was promoted at TechCorp. I hadn't contributed the slightest bit to it. I'd completely removed myself. He'd achieved it himself. He'd exceeded his targets, shown initiative, become more reliable. He called me himself, his voice ringing with restrained pride. Senior Sales Associate. Not rocket science, but progress. "Congratulations," I said, and it was nice to realize there wasn't a hint of sarcasm in those words. "I told the new team about you, about how my sister was consulting with David himself. They were impressed." "Okay, Kevin." "I'm trying. I know I screwed up. I know I was a terrible brother, but I'm trying to be better." "I see. Is that enough?" His voice held that same childish uncertainty. "It's a start," I replied. The following week, we had lunch together. We talked about his work, about my new projects. He asked questions about AI ethics, simple but sincere, and he listened to the answers. Not perfect, but real. Mom and Dad came to visit me in Palo Alto for the first time. They walked through my house, peered into my office where awards lined the shelves, diplomas and photos of famous people hung on the walls. They saw my life pieced together like a puzzle they'd previously refused to put together. "Beautiful," Mom whispered, looking out at the panoramic windows and the bay beyond. "Thank you. I wish we'd come sooner." "I know. We can do better?" She asked again, and there was hope in her eyes, as fragile as it had been then. "You're already getting better," I said. "Just keep going." A year after that fateful dinner, I was named to Forbes' Most Powerful Women in Tech list. My family, the whole family, threw me a party. Small, but real, with toasts not to family, but to me. Kevin raised his glass. His hand trembled. "To my sister, Sarah, who succeeded despite a family that refused to see her, who built an empire while we applauded my modest trophies, who proved that true success doesn't wait for recognition. It just happens because it can't help itself." Everyone applauded. Mom cried openly. Dad beamed with a quiet, unfamiliar pride. Kevin looked at me, and there wasn't a trace of the old threat in his gaze, only a complex, mature respect. It wasn't yet complete forgiveness. The wounds inflicted over the years don't heal with a single toast. But this was recognition, respect. And sometimes, you see, that's enough to breathe in the same space without pain. I remained on TechCorp's board for another 8 years. I helped guide the company through 3 major mergers, 2 CEO changes, and a quiet AI revolution that upended everything. Kevin stayed with the company. He rose to manager, then senior manager. He didn't become a star, but he became a reliable professional, a man who no longer measured his worth by my achievements. And every Thanksgiving, gathering around the table, we told this story. About how the CEO came to dinner with the family of an ordinary salesperson and discovered a member of his board of directors there. About how one evening turned the entire family universe upside down. About how the truth, finally spoken out loud, turned out not to be a destructive force, but the only tool capable of truly building something. I never checked my coat again. But I never forgot the most important lesson I learned that November evening. Success doesn't require recognition from those blind from birth. It requires only one thing: showing up to the world as you are, in all your glory. And the truth, sooner or later, will do the rest.